Hello, beautiful community. Hello, Banana Joe. Let us find out if I am audible. Am I audible? Hello, Paul. Am I audible? We're restarting. We might be an even smaller group now because people are fed up with all of this jumping around. So let's jump back into the questions. You're hearing me. You're hearing me. I don't know what I did wrong. Clearly, I moved my microphone from the other room where I meant to sit up. Hello, Michael. And in the process of me moving it here, somehow I may have not connected the wires properly. So we've said something about my style of communication. We've said something about optimism. We've said something about writing a book of fiction. We've spoken about YouTube comments. We've spoken about structural injustice and structural inequalities of various kinds as a sociological phenomena versus how you challenge sort of yourself and challenge the world as you go about building your own life and career, and that these things are not that you never want the sociological explanation to just eat up how you first personally traverse the world, even if you're doing it from a disadvantaged position. Spoken about chronic illness a bit. We've spoken about mental health a little bit. Anya was asking about music. So let's start with music. And then I have noticed a couple of the super thanks, then I'll come to them. So I did grow up in the Soviet Union, being sort of Soviet style, quite systemically, hello, Anne, trained. Until the age of 9. So I regularly did practice music theory, and there's a chance that I could have been on course for being a professional musician of some kind if I'd stayed in the Soviet Union. You know whether you're a professional musician normally by the age of 12. Maybe you don't know, but your parents should know. And then in Israel, there were different circumstances, a lack of the same opportunities, and I just suspended that. And then, of my own accord, and with a much less practical point of view, I systematically came back to music and musical experience. Right now, music is at the very heart of my life. And over the course of my life, it's very important to me that I make some kind of a contribution to music via applying language to very important conversations in and around questions like what does it mean to realize in sound in 2024 a composition that Mozart wrote in 1777? What kind of a thing is it? What does it mean to do it well? What kind of a place in our culture does that have, and so on? So I have a digital familiarity with the keyboard instrument, but that would never translate into me playing a piece from beginning to end in public. That would be unethical. But you may see some contact between me and an instrument on the music channel as I'm talking about particular pieces or particular scores, if and when that gets going. Simon is asking, I think that was a super thanks. Thank you, Simon. Do you regret being based in London post-Brexit? No, I don't. But I absolutely feel that Britain has de-Europeanized and London has de-Europeanized since Brexit. Most German people I knew in London left, for example. Germany is one of my favorite countries in the world. Most German people I know in London have left. And one of the ironies of Brexit is that it was based on an intolerance of a certain degree of immigration. But what's happened is that we have had even more immigration since Brexit. It's just not been from European countries, which should presumably piss off Brexit voters even more. So that's the paradoxical situation. Um, we've got even more people coming into the country, but we don't have Europeans coming into the country in the same way. And that has absolutely changed the cultural environment. London is a much less European city than it was a few years ago. Having said this, London is one of the most powerful cultural cities in the world, maybe together with New York. So, a London in decline is still one of the great cultural centers in the world. So, for instance, if you think about a very important art practice such as contemporary classical music, right? Compositions by Carter or Boulez being put on, and you ask a question, well, per city, how many thousands of people can we gather who are going to be extremely passionate about hearing that type of music? London would still be toward the top in the world, even though it's a less European city now. So Britain is in decline now, London is in decline, but its starting point is so high that a London in decline is still a very, very powerful cultural center indeed. Um, Mark, I might not take your question because I'm trying to comment more on personal things and not express particular views about um, theories of the world. Forgive me, and I'll perhaps come back to your question later um, in one of the next chats. Andrew, I'm an Orthodox Christian who's feeling extremely disappointed with how the church has become weaponized by Putin. Sure. Again, this is a question that probably I don't want to go into because it would require talking about the Russian Orthodox Church. What I'd say is that in other discussions, I promise to go there and maybe emphasize both the complexity of the story there and the fact that much of the upper echelon of that institution is a department of the Kremlin now. So, Rachel is asking, can optimism be a destructive force? Everything can be a destructive force. Certainly, false optimism can be a destructive force easily. We can easily see that. One of the things that I always struggle with, so this is a way of answering it personally, in my role as a public intellectual, so back to Russ's question, is that a lot of the despair people feel is because they have a delusory optimistic view of how the world works. And so paradoxically, one way of laying despair is to explore nauseatingly optimistic illusions, such as the Fukuyamian story of progress, that a lot of us still half feel or half believe. And that's a very difficult balance because it means that I have to dance between provoking you a bit, pushing you in a way that's a bit uncomfortable, in a way that's going to lose me subscribers as well, which I often do. I've often done deliberately. I've often deliberately lost subscribers, for instance. I've made decisions that I knew would lose me subscribers and gone ahead with them. But at the same time, you cannot just pour vinegar on people. People have to be given something tangible that is reassuring, that is hopeful, especially at a time when there's a lot of not just a sense of discombobulation with the political world, but also kind of a feeling of grief about the political world and a feeling of things not making sense, right? We often speak about Trump voters not making sense. of the world in a realistic way. But a lot of how we in this community see Trump voters is just one more mode of not being able to make sense. Because a lot of us in this community struggle to understand how they could be this way. Like, what are they on? What are they thinking? Why aren't they seeing this and that? Why have they given up on their institutions completely? So, them giving up on it um, is an extraordinary kind of crisis of trust and crisis of epistemic epistemic nature. But us not understanding them is one more manifestation of the same crisis. Them not understanding institutions and us not being able to understand how they can't understand institutions, right? Both are manifestations of the crisis of trust. So, one of the things I try to do is balance hope and truthfulness. And what I am optimistic about genuinely is that you can tell a hopeful story about where the world is going that is truthful, right? I don't think that a really truthful story about the world necessarily has to lead to despair. Um, so that's right at the core of my idea of this conversation that we're having. Let us have a look. Spec is saying, "Hi Vlad, when did you develop an interest in philosophy and what spurred it on? Are you ready to be bored? 260 of you, you ready to be bored? You're going to be bored." So I think that I am a philosopher. Sometimes it's that clear with certain personalities and that tie into a certain profession. We talked about how that can be very clear with musicians at the age of 12. So I had I made a very strange decision really in my early teens. And that is that I would work on developing my talent rather than on developing opinions. So everything I did really from the age of 14, 15 was all about developing my capacity for reflection, my capacity for imagination, my capacity for openness, but also engagement simultaneously, rather than doing what most smart teens do, which is, what is my view of the monarchy? What is my view of the existence of God? What is my view of how many parliaments a political system needs to have? What is my view of free will? I said, I'm uninterested in answering these questions because I'm not well placed to answer them yet. But what I am going to do is begin sort of developing my talent for developing my talent. And then there must have been a couple of moments which I needed to confirm something very important, which is not just that there could be something I love there, but that I have a contribution to make. And these came, I think, at the age of 16 and 17. At the age of 16 was when I first reached a basic level of intellectual confidence, where for the first time in my life, under very restricted conditions, I was opening to challenging an academic paper. If I'm 15 and I read something that a professor at Harvard has written about philosophy, I'm not going to challenge it, no matter what it says. At 16, I reached a point where 10% of it I could challenge. And at 17, I reached a different kind of confidence, which is that I could engage with um, philosophical ideas in a way that over time stood the chance of being extraordinary. That's to say, not competent enough to get an academic job, but extraordinary. That's to say, still pretty crappy relative to great philosophers, but extraordinary in the sense that it allowed it stood a chance of allowing me to move some pieces in philosophical conversations if I led a healthy life and thought and published. And then that got confirmed in a way I didn't really need it confirmed. I already knew it, but that got confirmed with my undergraduate and postgraduate experiences. And when I got sick with ME in 2003, I was a postgrad student at Oxford, and I already had a sense of sort of what I wanted to do over the next 30 years, what my short-term projects were in political philosophy, what my longer-term project in moral psychology were. Then I came back after partial recovery, after some improvement a few years later, to PhD work, quarter time. And now I'm in this paradoxical situation where I'm trying to make my public conversation sustainable in a way that then allows me to, in a parallel way, add the less public philosophical conversation. It'll also be public because it'll be coming out in pieces and hopefully eventually in a book or two. But um, my illness has meant that I have come out into the world first as a public intellectual of a very minor kind, and only second, I hope to come out as an intellectual. So that's the story. But is there a kind of a non-Vlad generalization there that's interesting? Yes. A lot of people who do imaginative or creative work are often motivated by a consciousness of their own powers. In other words, I don't give a hoot about doing philosophy if I thought I was average at it. There's just no point. What point is there in that? What point is there in doing very poorly paid work in a domain where you can just get away with having a career but without making an important contribution? Another time I can tell you how I rate myself as a philosopher, and you will be freaked out by how high that is, but also how low it is, depending on what your scale of comparison is. So enough narcissism about philosophy. Thank you, Spec. Jared, love back at you. Knyomo is talking about my idea of how all human beings have equal moral worth in the modern world, and saying that they don't share that assumption. And here I just challenge you. I think you do. You think all human beings are of equal moral worth. I believe that that would come out if we talked about it long enough. But again, I can't go into that because I want to stay personal. Ohms, cheers back at you. Thank you. Pangaholic is asking a fantastic question that I can't answer now because I'm staying personal, which is, why do so many political science graduates vote for Democrats and not Republicans? Jan has just been to London. Love back your way. Catalyst is saying, I'm worried about the US and the UK. I have a chance to move. I'm currently in the US, but I'm from the UK. I don't know what to do or where to go. Hugely dependent, right, on your age and on your family circumstances. My recommendation is always be more reckless if you're a male under 40 in experimenting and tasting. And if you are a female and you want to have children, do that under the age of 32, let's say. Um, you know, there was a question that I missed. Did I miss it? Oh, wow. I did miss a question from Garrett. A super thanks from the last conversation. Let's try this. Try a hand at it now. But that's really all I can say about moving. Be more courageous about taking risks like this if you are younger, and you can. You are less likely to regret it than you think, even if it doesn't turn out as you expect. Garrett, sorry we left you behind. Hi, Vlad. I want to be a philosopher. I have ADHD. Um, ADHD just triggers people so much. I get so many ADHD denial emails. People who think they're smart and they've worked out that ADHD doesn't exist. And it does exist, and it's real. And it's not a psychological thing, it's real. Could there be some risk of um, excessive self-attribution of ADHD in our culture? Yes, but there is also a massive underdiagnosis crisis. So this is a complex issue. I'm worried about reaching professional development. I have institutional worries. I have a need for recognition. I have a writer's block for over a year. I'm 23 and I have a maths degree. Okay. So, Garrett, the most important thing is that if everything you do between 23 and 30 turns out to be not stuff you want to continue doing, that's not a mistake. That's you tasting, experimenting life. So, you have an extraordinary amount of time to explore where you want to go. And now is an opportunity to taste and react, an opportunity that will not be there in the same way in your 50s. Moreover, people age psychologically differently in our culture. We're younger. A 45-year-old female in Berlin today is more like a 27-year-old female in 1984, even if she has family. Today, a 35-year-old male is like a 24-year-old male 40 years ago. So we arrive much more slowly because we are much more preoccupied with leading an authentic life. And we are much more, it's not that people in the past had fewer desires than we do. We are more entitled to have our desires realized. And so we're very, very conscious about making sure that we are leading an authentic life and we work out who we are. And that can contribute to a narcissistic culture. But in an individual case, it can be a good thing if handled well. So you have time, use it. Use it, please. Right? You're just looking at somebody who got chopped off in the early 20s and has had to live with very small time windows every day for 20 years, right? If you're not in that position, use that time. It's very precious. Number one. Number two, recognize that ADHD, depending on what kind you have and how serious it is a big deal. Not just in terms of your abilities and your limitations, right? It will make you really, really magically good at some things. It'll make you very spectacularly bad at certain things that everybody expects you to be competent at. Balance that. Understand that you can have security in yourself, even though you can't do certain things. You might not be able to read very well, for instance. Doesn't matter. So that's just understanding the limitations and special capacities that your ADHD gives you, but you also need to understand how you have handled your ADHD over the course of your life. ADHD people often have rejection dysphoria, criticism dysphoria. They have a lot of trauma from childhood that is partly a part of their ADHD itself and partly a part of people disliking them and reacting negatively to them. Work on that, look at that, right? So your ADHD in the way it actually structures how your mind works, but also all of the consequences of having lived with ADHD and any traumas you incurred from that. That's all very important. When you translate that into an institutional setting, whether it's work or a student, be extremely proactive and self-righteous about being accommodated. It may be that you need more time to complete certain projects. It may be you need to complete them in a different way. It may be that you work and think differently. Be assertive about that, right? Um, the social truth here is that if we accommodate people with ADHD better, they can make an absolute extraordinary contribution. They already do. But there's a lot of people with ADHD who aren't making the contribution they could make because we're not accommodating them flexibly enough, right? Um, so institutional accommodation of your ADHD is really important. Don't just be vague about it. Go and use every right you can squeeze out for yourself, um, and be assertive that you have ADHD and what it means. Understanding whether you want to be a philosopher is in the end going to be about two things. It's going to be about love. How much do you love it? And it's going to be about your sense of your capacity, right? So they're related, but they're not the same thing. How are they related? Well, you're going to love philosophy a lot more if you feel you can be quite good at it, right? You're going to enjoy it less if you feel philosophy is like being in a car with the engine turned off because you can't drive it anywhere. Well, that's not as enjoyable. So you're going to be exploring how much you can make a contribution, and you're going to be exploring how much you love it. And that also means that you're going to be discovering within philosophy where it is that you want to go. What kind of philosophy? What kind of philosophical tradition do you want to engage in? So be clear with yourself that it's possible that your first exposure or your second or third exposure to philosophy may be an exposure to a particular way of doing philosophy that you don't like, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of doing philosophy that you are going to like, right? Um, you may be exposed to a therapeutic Wittgensteinian model of philosophy that you reject. That doesn't mean philosophy isn't for you. It means that another way of doing it may be for you, right? So all of that is what you need to explore. And I don't think there is an urgency here. And obviously, in terms of your writer's block, you have to understand what place neurodiversity has in that. Um, then you're asking me, this is going to be very quick because it's a personal question, but it's also a philosophical question. Where does William sit inside Vlad? Where does Bernard Williams sit inside Vlad? Bernard sits very much inside Vlad, um, as much probably as Richard Wolfram does, another philosopher I love from the last 70 years. And because I'm ill, I'm so incredibly slow, and I've been promising on and off Bernard's life partner Patricia to write her a letter about my special relationship with Bernard. I hope to do that. There are going to be lectures on things to do with Bernard on the Philosophy Channel in time. So that catches us up a little bit. Going to go for maybe 15 minutes more. David, thank you for asking climate questions about ME. It depends. Some people love, um, some people do well in hotter climates, other people do really badly in them. I do better in hotter climates. Carl is asking, as a doctor, what do you want me to know about ME? I'm going to talk about that on the ME Diary channel. I think that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. It's really important. I can't answer about the Russian opposition because I'm only taking personal questions today, for which I apologize. Monica is saying, Vlad, I'm Monica, I'm a Catalan. Um, my mom is German. My biggest dream is to study philosophy, was to study philosophy. It wasn't possible. Now I'm 62. I'm sure I have always been analyzing throughout my life. You know, it, it, it's remarkable how our lives don't go as we plan, how much we control but also don't control, and how much life gives us things we didn't ask for. right? Vegan, the answer to your question about the overlap of long COVID and ME research is yes. Hello, Mantas from Lithuania. Do I like animals and pets? Yes, I have been a very proud owner of 2 pigs. And the main pig I owned was called Hillary. She was black with a white spot, highly intelligent, and thought I was her mum. This was when I was living in Tonga. It would not be compatible with my health now and would be unethical in the city to own a pig. But yes, I have a good relationship with pigs. So if you put me around pigs, I know how to communicate with them. I know how they work. Um, and I'll share a video of Hillary when I do another personal Q&A on the chat channel, I am sure. Rachel, why do you always wear white slash pastels on camera? Because I have 749 sort of white shirts. Below, I'm wearing weird sort of Japanese pants. I can look on certain days, I can look like I'm a kind of imperialist from the 1920s, sort of ridiculously cottony and white all round. Um, or I can wear some Thai fisherman pants. So part of this is because of my health issues. I don't have much of a distinction between indoor and outdoor clothes. So I think that's part of the explanation. Another part is that I just wear casual things that are very light and comfortable, and they are really the same whether I'm in bed or I'm out, as is extraordinarily infrequent somewhere in the world. I'm wearing the same thing. So if I'm in bed and I'm doing a talk in the real world somewhere, I'm going to be wearing the same things. Rachel is saying pigs are very intelligent. So I found pigs slightly more, and obviously hugely depends on the breeds. I found pigs slightly more intelligent than dogs, especially at the level of being able to comply with rules while noticing when exceptions arise and you can break the rules, that I haven't seen in dogs. So I've seen my pig make a decision that I wouldn't want her to apply the same rule in this different circumstance, and then break it in a way that I approved of. Um, I've also seen my pig solve quite complicated problems. For example, opening a tap of a water tank, of a rainwater tank, that required pulling the lever this way and then turning it. So these are two distinct moves, and she worked it out. But they're obviously also much harder to train, and my pig ate a little bit of Scott Moncrieff's translation of Proust's Swan's Way, and also ate a little bit of Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher. Olga and Joachim are asking, to what extent do I see myself as a Brit versus as a Russian? I see myself as a European. I see myself as a Russian to a very small extent, civically, virtually not at all. I mean, think about it. I left at 9, but I discussed that question in detail on the very last chat on this channel. So the answer is there in the 40-minute long chat. But my identity is overwhelmingly European, West European, Central European, and so on. My pig was also absolutely freaked out by the recordings of Wilhelm Furtwängler. She panicked and ran up and down the room and needed the music to be turned off. Furtwängler is the greatest conductor in the history of classical music. But without the classical music, she was fine. Let's not exaggerate my pig's sophistication. Um, but it was lovely to have pigs. But you need a lot of space and they're very destructive. I mean, they will dig up your whole garden. So you have to just understand that you're giving up on certain things completely. If you've got pigs, they are in some ways harder work than other pets. But also if you're allergic to cats or dogs, pigs could be a good option. Subs and Soda is asking if they're asking their question too many times. What is your question? Have I missed it? Oh, there we go. I also have CFS ME, which is what I call it. I call it ME. CFS is a crappy name. Because it implies that fatigue is a central symptom. It's not. I'm not fatigued at all. I'm just feeling deathly ill. Um, but probably more mild. But I also have to take care of my daughter. How do I balance being gentle for myself while also trying to be the best possible parent? Oh my word. So I presume you're asking me about taking care of your daughter because she is a child, not because she's also got a health issue. Is that right? There's a minimum zone of self-preservation that you have to protect, without which you can't give long-term and reliably what you need to give anyway. So it's very important to understand what that is physically, but also psychologically, because you're dealing with a lot of health challenges. And that's hard, bloody hard. So, what is in your life the equivalent of putting on your oxygen mask first and then your your baby's oxygen mask second in the plane? What's your equivalent of that? And that doesn't mean you can never compromise on that, because family life is extraordinarily demanding and disruptive and incompatible with chronic illness. But it's something you've got to do 4 times out of 5. So it's a question of sustainability, not crashing your health so it begins to get worse and worse. It also is about emotional sustainability and what is that minimal dose that allows you to be there for those you love. Um, I think it also means being quite ruthless about what you don't do, what you don't engage with. So it's about eliminating a lot of gray. I'm sure you're doing that already from your life for which you don't have time. So I'd also say that be very careful with aggressive, self directed emotions like guilt, um, of not being enough. I believe that if you're talking about emotional giving, certainly, it's possible to give an extraordinary amount in a short period of time. There's a lot that as a parent you can give in 60 minutes if it's a high quality 60 minutes. And so that's one thing um, that I'd say about this business of guilt. It's very dangerous if it gets out of hand. It's hard practically. Practically, you got to do what you got to do, but it's also important that these structures are realistic and sustainable. Whatever you got to get out of yourself practically. And I would say have a visceral and open conversation about what you feel and about your limitations with your child, however old they are. Don't hide this, because they then won't understand why things are the way they are. So you need a transparent and open conversation, not taking the burden of your illness and putting it on your kid, but from a position of love and strength, communicating. mummy really struggles with this and that. Mummy has done very well this week with this and that, but that and this has been really hard, and this means that that and that won't happen. Um, a child is also, depending on their age, but even if they're older, always at risk of thinking that whatever is wrong is their fault, right? Under communication risks generating that dynamic too. We could talk for hours about this, but this is just a couple of cents. What political figure would I resurrect? Sean is asking. That's not quite a personal question. I'll give it a go. It needs to be somebody who is institutional, but who has a populist touch. Therefore, the answer may be I wouldn't resurrect anybody because we have special conditions in our age that require special things of our politicians. Yes, I have no connection with Poland, and I do not speak Polish. I just mentioned incidentally that in terms of my genetic background, I am more Polish. I'm primarily assumed to be from the west part of Ukraine and Poland. I just mentioned that in the context of the chat I was having last time. Um, here on this channel, but I have no connection with Poland. I have much more of a connection with Czech in Central and Eastern Europe, a place I've been to many times and I know well. Um, my favorite classical music pieces. It's a funny question because when somebody has a profound relationship with that art form, the answer is going to be quite boring. It's just going to be the greatest ones. There's very little disjointedness, in my view, of classical music. Um, uh, very little disjointedness, such that if you ask me to rate, for instance, Beethoven's piano sonatas and ask me to say what's the top one, the second one, what are the top six out of the 32, I would rate the 32. I would rate the top six objectively, but I'd also probably say that they're the ones I love the most anyway. There could be a little bit of a gap there, a little bit of a misalignment, but it'll be marginal. So I'll just say that my favorite classical music pieces are the greatest pieces ever written. And here you talk about Mozart's piano concertos, Beethoven's string quartets, you name it. Why don't I like Zelensky personally? Artyom is asking. Um, so I think Zelensky is at the moment arguably the greatest political leader of the 21st century. Um, so it's not about that. I think he is a great political leader. By luck, I think he'd be a terrible political leader under most other circumstances, actually. Um, and that's what Ukrainians thought. I mean, most Ukrainians didn't like him. Um, so I could say some political things, right, about how he's an extraordinary communicator in some ways, but also a really poor communicator in other ways. And a lot of Ukrainians have felt a big communicative vacuum from Zelensky before the war, and in some ways during the war too. But I just say personally, I mean, you know, I could be outside of politics very good friends with Joe Biden. Really, that's compatible with him being a terrible or a great politician at the level of policy. So I'm just speaking in personal terms. I could never be close friends with Zelensky. Um, that would be a conversation a little bit about his trustworthiness. And trustworthiness here isn't about, oh, he's going to do something dodgy. It's going to be about how things sit in him how his integrity sits in him, what his ethical qualities are like. So it's not anything dramatic, and I do probably regard him as the strongest candidate for the greatest leader of the century so far. But I do think that there are personal qualities about him that I am not drawn to, really not drawn to. Um, Now, obviously, compare that with the repulsive monstrosity that is a complete degeneration of a person who's throwing around rockets at civilians in Europe, Mr. Putin, right? So Zelensky is a exquisite comparatively, but yes, I mean, I'm not enormously drawn to Zelensky, and that's an expression of my being a bit familiar with. I've never met Zelensky in person, never seen him in person, but I'm familiar a little bit with his career. I know who he is a little bit in a way that cartoonishly my audience doesn't, because they don't speak Ukrainian or Russian. They don't know anything about Zelensky except for February 2022 onwards. So yeah, maybe I'll say a bit more about it if I do a video about him. I might do a video on the main channel about why he stayed, how that worked for him psychologically. Boom, I'm not going to leave, which is an extraordinary political act, right? Great political act. Um, so there we go. Sam, thank you. Artyom, it's a poor answer, but I might say more about it. But don't think there's something dramatic there. I have some kind of conspiracy theory about Zelensky. I don't have anything like that. Safeguard is asking about works of literature that I've found meaningful in shaping my views on life, philosophy, and politics. Again, a lot of my answers are going to be conventional. I'm going to be talking about Shakespeare quite a bit. If we move more to the political realm, then at a level of sensibility, I do see that I'm part of a kind of trying to be part of a kind of tradition that certainly involves Thucydides, involves Machiavelli, involves a way of talking about politics that is a way that demands to come fully to terms with the extraordinary range of constructive and destructive energies that human beings have. Outside of great literary works, I'm particularly drawn to writing that manages to combine depth and lightness. There's an essay by Calvino from the 80s called On Lightness, which is really a lovely and fantastic, but a crap in comparison restatement of something that Nietzsche does at the end of one of his books, The Gay Science, where he ends by giving us a lightness, substituting it then by heaviness, and then returning to a lightness that has gone through heaviness and come back out. In the Russian dimension, I have a disproportionately low view of Russian classical music and a fairly conventional view of high view of Russian literature. What stages of growth were there in your thought process? Were they external or internally driven? They were internally driven, if I understand what you mean by that, Otago. The trouble with my profession is that people arrive in it at a very late stage. Um, That's to say, as with conducting in classical music, moral philosophers often only mature by the age of 70. The problem I have with that is that I'm sick and I'm only working a very small amount of time. So, what does that mean for my development? And how do I keep it rapid despite not having most hours in the day? That's one of the challenging dances that I'm dancing. But I'm always improving as a philosopher, even though tragically I'm doing very little philosophy, and I want to make space to do more because that's who I am. Today's greatest thinker in philosophy, I do not think that there are any great philosophers who are alive today. I think there were a few who were alive 30 years ago. The two philosophers I love and admire the most who are alive today just about are both very much in their 90s, and that's Alistair MacIntyre and Charles Taylor. And funnily enough, they're both Catholics, and I am um, not religious. Um, but when philosophy is done on a high enough level, these differences become minor, actually, or become complex at least. So Alistair MacIntyre and Charles Taylor, the two most impressive social philosophers living today. Um, wow. Um, First Walkman, I think that may be too big a question today. How can people realize within themselves that they have neurodiversity? I think it's a really great question. But even before answering, I need to explain why I might be a person who knows enough about answering that. So I'm going to postpone that if that's okay. Historically, philosophy has worked as a background for political leaders. Do you think this is still the case? Well, again, I don't want to say too much, but um, what I'd say is this. There are a lot of political projects that pretend that they aren't about ideas, but are actually deeply about ideas and are deeply ideological. Thatcherism was a great example of that. Sean, do you find it hard not to get over analytical? No, I'm not very analytical. Um, One of the questions that I've just come across for a personal Q&A is what am I on the Myers-Briggs personality test that I don't take to be a deep thing, but I just take to be a really useful short hold for categorizing people. And I am there are four letters there. I am marginally E. I have a lot of introversion, but some extroversion too. My extroversion is mostly about the fact that I don't really get shy or embarrassed. So if you ask me to do a lecture naked in front of a big audience of strangers, I might think that's ridiculous, but I wouldn't be shy about it. And then the next bit is about um, roughly how intuitive you are and versus how much you proceed more analytically. And I'm an extreme of something like 90-10 there. So I am a profoundly non-analytical intelligence. That is a strongly analytical intelligence, but I'm profoundly non-analytical. Um, you can't be a philosopher unless you're strongly analytical, though. But that's where I tilt, so I have no risk of being excessively analytical. Um, and probably most of my thought, anyways, in terms of images or music or in terms of various kinds of images, imagination, intuition, all of that is central to how I work. Um, and then thought and feeling are balanced with more feeling than thought for me in the third category. So I'm not what I seem to be, because I seem to be very calm and calculated and blah blah blah. I am calm, but I'm not uh I'm obviously not an S on the Myers-Briggs, and I'm less obviously, but still not a T. I am a P, not a J. That's nearly compulsory for us. I have a lot of J, but I'm a P. And then the comical thing, sometimes it's added how assertive you are. And I'm 97% assertive, which some of you may have discovered. So I am an ENFP. It's quite a lot. There's quite a lot of ENFPs in the world, but I'm in some ways quite an extreme ENFP. My N is something like 88%. Um, Now, don't think I think that this is a profoundly explanatory psychological model. I don't think it is. It's useful at the level of, oh, I've got a new job, and Erica and Ricky and Susanna and Barry are my co-workers. How do I place them? By just capturing it in 30 seconds. For that, the Myers-Briggs can be useful. Well, I mean, SVR is asking what's it like to be analytical. If I walk into a room and I meet you, my first thing is almost at a physical level to try to feel what it's like for you to be in the world. What's that like for you to be in the world? What's it like for you to have a bad day? What are you feeling right now? Um, what is your emotional world like? It's not to say, what are your 10 beliefs and do I think you're right or wrong? Yeah, I mean, Dazzle is asking me how I know about this. I mean, I have ADHD and autistic people very close in my life in the way that I'm exposed to on a regular basis. So it's not just that I read articles about it. Sander is asking, are the US elections coming to be historically significant? Let's try to get this emotionally. I think all major elections are going to feel significant in this age of democratic decline, because we're always going to ask, how much are our institutions going to be ground down by potentially a bad outcome in the election? So we're always going to be feeling that. And what I'm very passionate about is I don't want you to have 11 freakouts if you can have 3, because we're in on a long journey and we don't want to squeal every time a bad wave comes and hits us. We want to be vigilant. What we don't want to do is um, sleepwalk through a big hole developing in our boat that begins to help us take, that begins to make us take water on, and begins to sink us. We don't want to be oblivious to that, but we don't want a bump from a nasty wave um, to send us into a spiral that makes us sort of unconstructive in the way we handle our conditions at sea generally. Okay, we've done a long chat, so let's try to begin winding it down a little bit. I know you admire Monsieur Nothing is saying Isaiah Berlin, who said similar things to Raymond Aron, especially about anti-teleology. Yeah, I think there's a lot of differences there, but I'm not gonna try to go there now if that's okay. But I promise to get to most of these conversations on the philosophy channel. Pavlo is asking what languages I speak. I don't speak any language perfectly. Um, but virtually everything I do is in I operate in English. I spoke about my relationship with the Russian language a bit in the last video on the chat channel. And there was a period in my life where Hebrew was my preferred language. When I came to England, Hebrew was my preferred language, but I've now mostly forgotten it. Symmetry OX. Let's try to take this question. If I can say something useful, it'll be the last question we take. If I can't, we'll take one more. Symmetry OX, can you help me deal with emotional fatigue from job searching? UK company closed business 2 months ago, and I'm exhausted from hundreds of applications and a dozen interviews. It's so dehumanizing. I'm not sure that my strengths express themselves in helping you with this. So I've got to be conservative. If you told me how do I become a better artist or whatever, then I could help. Look, this is not serious advice. This is just speaking between friendly acquaintances on the internet. I think a hell of a lot depends on your financial situation and whether you're going to be in a financial emergency unless you get a job. And so that's one issue, right? Don't push yourself if you have some financial breathing space. Don't drive yourself into a cycle of bad sleep, you know, a worse place psychologically. If you've got some breathing space, use it financially, a couple of months extra, right? So take a break from this squirrel in a wheel situation that you're in if you can. If you can't, my advice would be to say no to this. But in life, saying no to something is often not something that you can express overnight. It can be, I am done with this. I reject this. Which means by 7 years from now, by 5 years from now, I want to be in a place where I've made significant steps away from being dependent on this. Can I do this? How do I explore this? So there's a lot of power in saying no to something that you can't reject today, but saying no to something that you can constructively and realistically perhaps reject over a 5-10 year period. So, I refuse to work for that kind of organization, even though I have no option at the moment not to. And then you give yourself a time frame where you get closer to having an option for an alternative way of making a living. So this idea of saying no in a time frame that is, let's say, a few years, an eighth of your life, let's say. That's a mode of rejection that is realistic in the situation where you are in your career and you have to make money. Claudio is asking, how do you become a better artist? Well, I have an infinitesimal consulting enterprise where I have 2 or 3 hours a month where people can talk to me one-on-one. And some of what I do now is in that realm also about civic and political projects people are trying to get off the ground, and they're asking me, how do I grow in a way that is commensurate with exploring whether I can build up a project like this or not? What are my capacities here realistically? What growth do I need? But historically, I've done such work also with professional artists who are stuck often in the middle age period. The single biggest problem that professional artists at the age of 50 run into is an incapacity to make a distinction between the thing itself and the idea of the thing. So let's say you're a filmmaker and you are profoundly committed to tactility as a value, touch, but your films express not tactility, but the idea of tactility. Right? So this is an example of an artist confusing depth with the idea of depth. Most artists reach for depth, but only grasp the idea of depth and not the capacity to express depth. So how do you unlock yourself out of that dynamic? This is about self-exploration. This is so often about confidence. This is so often about play. And this is so often about the capacity to differentiate first from second from third rate emotions. It's a capacity to recognize yourself in sentimentality or in giving a pseudo version of something rather than the thing itself. That's not an answer, but it's a tiny snippet. Beautiful community. We have done enough today. Thank you so much. Try me more with questions like this next time we do a personal Q&A. I think I was right that I could pull this off just about, but I probably couldn't answer proper political questions today from bed. I'm so grateful that you've been with me. I can't connect and stitch together the two lives for anybody who wants to watch them later, but they're just going to be two separate bits, a half an hour bit and this hour bit. And we're going to be back very soon. The next video on the main channel will come as soon as I'm able to set up and tape it. It will come, and I'll be here regular with you on the chat channel. And if you want to know about how my health is doing, I'll probably come through with a little update on the ME Diary, Vlad's ME Diary YouTube channel. How grateful I am for all of you to have been with me. Thank you for alerting me to the fact that I was speaking without sound on the previous live. Thank you so much. And I'll be seeing all of you very, very soon. Take really good care, please, and go gently.